Hello, and welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast, the podcast where we talk all things justice over coffee with special guests. On this episode, I talk with the award-winning filmmaker and CEO of the Exodus Cry campaign group, Benjamin Nolot, or Benji for short. You may have seen some of his work already. He has a documentary out on Netflix at the moment called Liberated, the New Sexual Revolution, which we discuss a little in the podcast. He also directed and produced the human trafficking themed documentary film Nefarious, Merchant of Souls, which is available to stream for free on YouTube if you haven't seen it yet. Do you remember in the last podcast when we spoke to Lexi? She referred to watching this film at high school, and that moment actually being one of the ways she came to identify what happened to her in her younger life and led her to speaking out. Benji and his team started the Exodus Cry campaign group on the back of the Nefarious documentary, and that group has been taking on big porn recently. I don't know if you've seen the Trafficking Hub campaign on Instagram, which is calling out Pornhub and their owners MindGeek over the many crimes that take place on their websites, with revenge porn, trafficking victims, and countless videos of children being uploaded and broadcast every day. Benji has a new film coming out in September called Raised on Porn, which we also get onto in our chat. So let's get into it, shall we? Benji, welcome to the podcast. I embrace you as a friend. We haven't yet had a chance to meet, but I'm very aware of your work. I'm a big fan of what you've been doing, and I've been so excited to have you on the podcast. Now, these things, they always start the same way. So before we even begin to get into all the many topics I hope we can address, I've got to ask you, it's morning there in California, right? It's evening here. Tell me you're a coffee drinking man. Tell me that at least.
I am. I start every day with a flat white. That's my go-to drink. 2 Restrepo shots, some steamed milk. Great way to get the day started.
Double shot. Good man. That is what I like to hear. You know, it wasn't until I started a coffee company that I never knew how many people don't drink coffee. But that is when I knew we'd get on. That's a good start. So what I want to talk about is your documentary experience, or the experience of making the documentaries you have. Nefarious was when I first came across you and the Exodus Cry movement, and I was just blown away. I thought it was a masterful piece of documentary making. I want to dive into all of those things, but I also want to just get to know you a little bit and find out who's the man I'm talking to over today. Talk to me about life as a young guy in I know you're in California. Did you grow up there? What was life like for you before this journey started?
Yeah, grew up in Southern California, and it's, we've got the mountains, we've got the beach. It was a great environment to grow up in. I was the youngest of 4 kids, a bit sheltered growing up. The issue that we're going to talk about today was first introduced to me through a film called The Accused that I saw when I was 11 years old. And that movie depicted the gang rape of a woman named Cheryl Arroyo. And that was really my first awakening to the knowledge of the presence of evil in the world. And so I feel like, even growing up here in this idyllic area, I wasn't fully sheltered from the realities that you and I are now addressing in the world. But that was just a seed that was deposited in my heart that wouldn't come into full manifestation or fruition until much, much later. Growing up, I was always outdoors, surfing, fishing, playing hockey. I loved, I have a thirst for life and a love for life and a love for humanity. Was very drawn to the arts and filmmaking early on, and then sort of like went in my early 20s through my 20s, kind of went on a spiritual journey. I was really asking bigger questions about life and, who I am in this world and what are the things that I want to get out of this life. And and who is God? And, you know, I was just asking big life questions. And during that season, uh, I discovered the issue of human trafficking. And so, you know, we can, I guess, get into that at some point, but that was my burning bush, you know, experience that really helped cement my focus and calling and direction for life.
It's interesting that you mentioned that film, The Accused. I don't know if I've seen it, but it's time and time again when I talk to people that have committed a part of their life to fighting injustice, it began having watched a film, be it Taken or Whistleblower or something. I really believe in the power of media, in the power of storytelling, because it has this nature to invade people and reach them in the safety of their own homes, but also to motivate them into action. It's interesting that that's the case for you in this instance. So with the filmmaking, did you go at it from an approach of, I'm going to expose injustice, I'm going to take a camera and I'm going to go out and search? Or was it, I love filmmaking, hey, I wonder if I can do something about these things that I'm passionate about? Which way around was it?
Sure. Yeah, when I first discovered that this issue was even happening, I began to just try to research everything available online, or whatever books, documentaries were available. And there was very little awareness about human trafficking back during this time in 2007. And so I started to feel like, man, we really need to help tell the story of what's going on related to this issue. And it was like pulling a bit of yarn, you know, and I didn't really know what I was signing up for, what I was getting myself into. But I felt like the story needed to be told in a way that could help connect people to the realities of what was going on. So that was the point at which I really just, you know, felt compelled to marry these two passions, a passion for filmmaking with a passion for, you know, addressing this injustice of human trafficking and fighting for the lives of those who had been trafficked. And so that decision compelled me to begin this journey. We arranged a filming trip to Southeast Asia that was 6 weeks long. And I imagined that this would constitute the entirety of our filming, and we would come back and edit that and put this documentary out. But um, while I was on that trip, I was just, the kind of like the whole world opened up to me in a way that I hadn't previously seen it. And I made a decision.
Were you going there to shoot something on human trafficking? Is that right?
And so I think it was at that point that I just kind of decided, like, I don't know where this story is going to take us or how long it's going to take to document, but I'm signing up to go on that journey. And we ended up traveling to 19 countries and 42 cities on 4 continents over the course of about 4 years to complete Nefarious. And it's a global snapshot of sex trafficking. So for anybody that's watching this or listening to this, I feel like Nefarious is still a really great resource for people to introduce them to the issue. And you can kind of see how this issue operates in different parts of the world, and then the connecting factors, you know, source countries, destination countries, underlying factors, with also a very hopeful, redemptive solution at the end, epilogue. And so I think there was something that guided me in the creative process of making Nefarious, was this quote that I had once heard. It said, there are two things that pierce the human heart: tragedy and beauty. And so we felt like, you know, Nefarious really captures the palpable tragedy of human trafficking, but also offers a really palpable sense of hope at the end. And so yeah, so I think you know, anyone watching this can access it on our YouTube channel, Exodus Cry YouTube. And still to this day, we get so much traction with that film. So very encouraged to see how it has helped awaken people to this issue and opened up doors for us to raise awareness, to change laws, and inspire others to start organizations and get involved in the fight.
That is remarkable. 4 years to make. And what did you say? I wrote it down. Was it 19 different countries?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really comprehensive look at the issue. And I remember when I first came across it, like, I got to be honest with you, Benji, I was so ready not to like it. What does that say about me and my character? But I was so ready not to like it, right? To sit at it and pick holes in it. I think because I've seen the subject done poorly so many times, a really superficial version. I think I have an issue with that rescue narrative, and that even as a former investigator, like it's not all about the rescue, and I think that can be portrayed inaccurately and unhelpfully. And so I was ready. I was going, what's this going to be? Like half an hour in, I'm like, this is solid. Like you did an excellent job, mate. And you've got a nice, because I've seen the Liberated as well on Netflix, and you've got a nice filmmaking style. Like I did film. I mean, this is going back, but when I was at so I hated my high school. So when I got to college, now in the UK, college is like your last 2 years of high school, right? So we stopped going to high school at 16. And our college is 17 and 18 years old. So I was like, I hate school. I'm going to do all subjects that have nothing to do with sort of traditional academia, and one of them was film studies, right? I loved it. This is amazing. I get to come to school and watch films all day. And I remember studying documentary makers and Nick Broomfield and like Biggie and Tupac, and the way he was like one of the first to sort of introduce himself into the documentary, to step behind in front of the camera and sort of and I thought, yeah, you kind of do that in a passive way. I don't know if you have any inspirations in documentary film. Obviously, Britain has got some fantastic ones, but like I've watched Michael Moore, but I don't know who are your sort of go-to guys for being inspired by in that field.
I don't know. It's constantly changing and evolving. I mean, I'm inspired by different things. So I really was inspired by the story of War Photographer and just the creative elements of that film. I was inspired by the activism of the Cove, and really how to use documentary to address an important social justice issue. I've been inspired recently by a film called The Vanishing at the Cecil Motel, and just the emphasis on really cinematic reenactments. So I and of course, Errol Morris. I mean, he was, really the one who pioneered highly cinematic reenactments in documentary. So I'm inspired by, I love the genre. I think the genre is really, really important. It is the small voice of conscience in our world, still left in our world. And I know for me, documentaries have really helped shape my understanding of the world, on really any issue. And so I have a high value for the genre, and we try to treat it with that level of reverence and respect. And really, I'm governed. I feel like I'm driven more by ethics and values per se than I am a certain style. I think the style can adapt itself to whatever the story is. So with Nefarious, we felt like I could be a helpful guide for a viewer to kind of sort of like vicariously go on this journey with, where I'm not overtaking the story, but I'm somebody to connect to as we're like seeing these different things from different parts of the world. But in some of the newest films that we're getting ready to release, I'm not in them at all. And the style is completely different. So really, it's an issue of just with each story that we take on, what is the appropriate style? What is the best way to tell this story? So there's a quote from Michelangelo. He said, "I see the angel in the marble, and then I carve it out." And I think that's a great way to describe the creative process, you know, is like you have a sort of like a deeper vision of and almost like a gut feeling of like what you're trying to accomplish, but the creative process is bringing that to life. And that process for us takes years. You know, it's not with narrative films, a lot of it boils down to how quickly can you write a screenplay, because once that's done, then lining up everything else is pretty straightforward. Even the edit is, you know, relatively straightforward, because you're basing, you know, you have a certain amount of shots and a certain amount of lines that are given. With documentary, it's a completely different process, and I respect both genres, but documentary is much more involved from the standpoint of shaping the clay. You're going out, you're gathering tons of information, you're pulling that information in, and then it can take years to craft and to edit that into a cohesive, coherent story. And so I'll start with, you know, one idea of what we want to accomplish, and then where we end up could be somewhere, you know, sort of like in the ballpark, but like much different than I originally imagined. And that's been the case with everything that I've done. And we're really excited about some of the new projects that we have coming out. So we did Nefarious, and then we did Liberated, which is more about the kind of the cultural underpinnings. And then now we're about to release a documentary here in July, August, called Raised on Porn. That's about porn's impact on consumers. So really like, what's porn's role in this whole larger issue? And we feel like it's a very compelling film that's relevant to just about everybody out there today, because we've all been exposed to pornography, you know, and some of us from a very young age. And so this film aims to address that audience, that demographic of people who have been exposed to pornography, to really help us quantify the impact of that. So we're kicking off a campaign called Protect Kids, Not Porn. And this film, Raised on Porn, will be a central aspect of that, really hoping to kind of move the needle on porn's impact on our world.
So let's get into that. Before we do, I want to drag you back to the first film, and you go to Holland, and like most of the audience to this podcast are British. I think 70%. The rest of it is all over the world, fantastically international, and a good chunk over there in the US. But a lot of people over here in the UK will have made that trip across the water. From actually in Norwich, it's literally like you're taxiing to take off. We're now touching down, and you're in Amsterdam. It's literally like a 15-minute in the air flight across the water. And I think most of us at some point have probably been there and walked along the alleys with the red lights, and looked in the shop windows with young women standing there and in some cases waving and beckoning you in, and people giggling and taking pictures. And certainly my experience of it the first time I went, I don't know how old I was. It wasn't that long ago, maybe mid-20s, I don't know. It really disturbed me. And as a cop at the time, I'd seen some pretty chilling things, but it really disturbed me, the commercial nature of it, the exposure of it. And we had Esther Stein, who's an amazing woman, and she's South African. She lives in Holland, and she's written some strong pieces about the sex industry, particularly how poor the consequences of the legalization of sex in Amsterdam, in Holland, and the malicious, the pernicious impact of that, and how actually it's not empowering. All it's done is it's left the door open for organized criminal gangs to have carte blanche and trafficking human beings. And I thought you covered that well. And you mentioned about, I start a documentary and then we see where it goes. Like, I wonder whether when you started Nefarious in Cambodia and found yourself in Eastern Europe, or at least in Amsterdam, it's okay, this is like, what are we doing here? What was that learning experience? What took you from child sex trafficking in Cambodia over to commercial, legal prostitution in civilized, developed society?
It was the idea that when we got into this, that trafficking looks this certain way. Somebody gets abducted and then they're forced into prostitution, and then that's it. And when we went to Southeast Asia, we learned that it's much more of a cultural phenomenon in Southeast Asia, and where this is part of their GDP, and girls from a young age are conditioned into believing that part of their value as a human being is what they can earn in a sex market. And this so there what we discovered in Southeast Asia, and even within Southeast Asia, the story is different from country to country, with some overlapping realities. But like in Thailand, for example, where girls growing up in the hill tribe areas are not given Thai citizenship, are driven by their families into the cities looking for work, and it's very well understood that the young girls in the family bear the responsibility for helping to support the family, while the boys there's a higher value placed on them, like going to school and things like that. So these vulnerable young girls will be driven down into these cities and then preyed upon by all the massage parlors, girly bars, karaoke bars, and turned out for sex. And so there was this whole cultural phenomenon where we realized, okay, it's not just somebody being abducted. There are other underlying push and pull factors that are sending large demographics of vulnerable young girls into the sex industry. And then there's the demand side of that equation, where Southeast Asia has become a fixture for pedophiles around the world. So they are, drawn to these places from Japan, from Germany, from the UK, from America, from men around the world congregate to these places looking for that. And so there's this whole supply and demand reality. Well, as we began to discover all of this going on in Thailand and Southeast Asia, we were surprised to run into two girls who were from Russia.
Oh wow!
And these girls were flirting and bantering and clearly, in the sex industry. And then we asked them this question: how did you guys get here? Like, we're in Thailand. Like, why is there a couple of Russian girls here? Right. And instantly their faces went sober. One of them got tears in her eyes, and they just said, we can't talk about that. And so we inquired with an organization that was working on the ground there, and so we don't even reach out to the Russian girls because their situation's so hopeless. They're under the control of organized crime in a very intense way. And so then we started to realize, like, okay, there's an interconnectivity, global interconnectivity to this issue as a result of globalism. And we just began to inquire, like, what is happening in Russia? And then how is what's happening in Russia and Eastern Europe affecting what's going on in Western Europe? And so we started to try to piece together different realities that were happening in trafficking in different parts of the world. And ultimately that led us to Amsterdam, which is more of a destination country. Amsterdam sort of put out the welcome mat for people to come there and to buy women for sex. Amsterdam has one of the most famous red light districts in the world. And so by virtue of that, it has become a vortex for the most vulnerable demographics of people around the world, who are marginalized and vulnerable for any number of reasons. But then, third-party facilitators like pimps and traffickers will bring these poor, impoverished, marginalized, abused, et cetera, demographics of people to Amsterdam, put them up in apartment houses, rent out a window, and then turn them out in these windows to, again, men coming in from America or the UK or Germany or Japan or other parts of Europe. So it's a complex issue, and it took us a long time of really doing a deep dive into it to begin to pull it apart and try to present in a way that would be coherent for an audience, to really turn on some lights to understand, okay, this is what's going on, this is why it's going on, and this is what we can do about it.
Yeah, you did a terrific job of it. And there's a growing tide. I know it's in the US as well, because I was on a call, a camp run by a campaign group, good one. I just didn't happen to really agree with the sway of it, about sex work. And the answer to sex trafficking is to decriminalize sex work internationally. That's the answer, right? So we don't want to even legalize in Holland, in Germany, in parts of the world where there's a degree of state involvement, there's a degree of licensing, of regulation. No, we don't want that. We want self-regulation, self-control. We can protect ourselves. Just leave us alone. We want to pay tax. It's going to be empowering. I want to be treated like a human being. Now, I can understand that criminalizing sex workers makes them increasingly vulnerable. It makes them less likely to go forward to the police, less likely to stretch out a hand and say help. So I don't think that's an effective strategy. My concern about this growing movement that says the decrim is the answer. We've got the likes of Amnesty International behind this, and some significant players in the human rights movement have said, no, this is right. For me, Benji, and you're very welcome to disagree. For me, that's madness, because the people you've described are the people, from my experience of investigating sex trafficking, that populate the sex industry are not university educated. Yes, there will be, but that is not representative of sex workers worldwide, full, that are self-affirmed, confident, and demand above all things to be recognized and given respect because of what lifestyle they've chosen. That is a minority of cases. In the most part, it is people with extreme vulnerabilities being exploited by third parties. And so anyway, I'm probably just exercising my own thoughts greedily there on a podcast where I'm interviewing you. But I have heard you speak on it. You spoke extremely powerfully on it in an address to the UN. I would wanted to know your views.
Yeah, I mean, as an abolitionist, I reject the term sex work altogether because of what it implies. In my view, sex and desire are inextricably linked. And when you have sex without desire, that results in exploitation, regardless if somebody's getting paid for it. The entire basis of prostitution, sex, happens on the basis of a lack of desire. One person wants the sex, one person doesn't, therefore payment takes place. So the entire premise of prostitution is a premise of exploitation. It is one person wants the sex, one person doesn't, therefore payment takes place. But that doesn't solve the fact that even though that payment is taking place, the person is going to experience that sex as a form of sexual violation. And so they have to dissociate and go through all kinds of mental gymnastics in order to survive the experience of prostitution. And so I think that's, to me, like, just that basic fundamental premise is a really important piece. The other thing is that prostitution is a system of gender inequality. When you think about the people in prostitution, we're talking about 98 to 99% men who are the buyers and 98 to 99% women who are the ones being bought. So prostitution is a construct of male demand. And it is one of the last strongholds of gender inequality left in our world. And so when I think about, as an abolitionist, when I think about trafficking and prostitution, I really try to develop a systems level analysis to understand what is this, and then what is the best way for us to address it. So I view prostitution as a system of violence, exploitation, and gender inequality. And as a result of that, I want to eradicate it. I think that the abolition or Nordic model of legislation has proven to be the most effective means to do that. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is this law that was first developed by Sweden, which I refer to as the abolition model of legislation. Some people refer to it as the Nordic model. This legislation, first of all, it creates criminal culpability for the men who are purchasing people in the sex industry. And so when you think about at the very root level, this of human trafficking and the larger commercial sex industry at a very root level comes from the demand on the part of men for illicit sex. If men stopped buying women and children for sex, the entire commercial sex industry would implode overnight. So the commercial sex industry necessitates demand, it markets demand, it wants to increase demand. And we see this in areas where prostitution has been legalized, decriminalized, endorsed, places like Amsterdam, places like Germany, just changing the landscape of these countries in terms of how men understand and relate to women sexually. And so what Sweden said is we're going to criminalize the purchase of sex, create criminal culpability for the people who are fueling the demand, who are the demand. But then the other thing that they said, and the other reason why this law has been so effective, is that it addresses the vulnerability of people who are being drawn into the sex industry. And rather than giving them a criminal label and adding to the burden of what is already a difficult life circumstance for them, this model of legislation offers programs and services to those vulnerable people. And so Sweden has really been a success story in the fight against trafficking, and they have eradicated trafficking in their country. Even the chief of police in Sweden speaks very highly of this law and is one of the greatest advocates of it because he has seen the effectiveness of it. And so in our view, this law is really important and a critical part of getting to the deeper root issues for why the commercial sex industry and all the exploitation and trafficking that goes with it has become so prominent in our world today.
It's interesting. I mean, I don't know how I feel about the Nordic model, if I'm honest. If I had to pick one, I probably lean that way against the other options, but I can understand, having spoken to sex workers, why they would say, well, hang about, you criminalize the toms, you're still making me vulnerable. I can understand sex workers that have said, I'm never going to stop selling myself. This is my only option due to my immigration status, due to my education, due to whatever my psychological heart, whatever's happened, whatever reason, whatever motivation, that they still consider that their only source of survival. And there's a question over how realistic is that aim of reducing demand? Can we ever sufficiently target that, whether it's through legislation or through cultural education or whatever? But I think what I agree with the premise of the Nordic model is that it's not about necessarily the who's getting nicked tonight, right? Who's getting arrested? It's about how do we get people from a position of vulnerability that causes them to engage in the sex industry as their option? How do we get them out? Right? What do you need? How can we support you and give you an alternative lifestyle, give you hope, give you something beyond this? And that I'm a complete supporter of. I just think there is no panacea to the exploitation of human beings. Of course, we've got to look for something. We've got to look for hope. We've got to have hope, and we've got to strive for that. But it's a difficult issue. I find the issue difficult, but I know what I'm not for, and that's for turning the lights off and saying, oh, we're all fine here, just leave us alone, which I think is only going to lead to the increase in vulnerability, to the increase in trafficking, and it concerns me. Now, I don't know if you mind me introducing this into our conversation in regards to your faith. I know you're a Christian man, and it's the Christian element of what you're doing in pursuing sex trafficking, in pursuing injustice, and holding a torch and lighting it up and saying this is what's going on out there, and doing a fantastic job of. You included that in the Nefarious documentary. That is the hope, right? But some people will say, well, I'm not a believer. Like, where do I fit in here? If I don't believe in God or in Jesus or Christian faith or any faith or whatsoever, like, where's my hope in this subject? I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
My personal inspiration comes from my faith in Christ, because I see modeled in Jesus a life of compassion. His life was characterized by compassion and love, and so to me, like, the story of the Good Samaritan really summarizes and embodies the life of Jesus and his approach to addressing vulnerability in our world, and so I think a lot of people maybe interpret their faith through this idea of various belief systems against each other. It's more of an intellectual
Dogma, yeah.
thing. I see the story of the Good Samaritan and what Jesus embodied is more about a way of being in the world in which we are compassionate towards those around us. That means what? So basically, the story of the Good Samaritan kind of it begs the question of what is your response to vulnerability, the vulnerability that is around you. And so for me, that is a huge inspiration for how I want to live my life. Obviously, Jesus sets a very high standard that none of us are ever going to achieve. We're weak, broken human beings, but he provides a model for how to be in the world that can be a source of life and healing and help and blessing to others. And that's what I want for my life. So and when it comes to our work and working with other people, we, everybody has a seat at the table when it comes to addressing this issue. We don't try to qualify people in or out based on what they believe or don't believe. We're looking at like where do we agree, and how can we set aside maybe some of our differences in order to accomplish this goal of ending the commercial sexual exploitation of women and children throughout our world. So that's really where we stand on it. Even in Nefarious, it wasn't something that we imposed on the film. It was us following the story of people whose journey brought them to a place of having these powerful supernatural experiences that ended up ultimately transforming and changing their lives and pulling them out of this pit of exploitation. And so we've seen the hand of God at work in some of the most, darkest, tragic situations in the world, and that has massively increased our faith, just to see how some of these individuals whose lives seem so hopeless were miraculously transformed.
I find it really interesting because I know I'm sure you have far more than I have, but I've received a small amount of criticism for some of my views on these subjects, and that's good. That's okay. I got no issue with that. I'm sure you've had plenty as well. But I was watching a documentary by Louie Theroux the other day. Have you heard of Louie Theroux?
Yeah.
I love Louie Theroux. Like,
yeah,
I know
I love his movies.
He's great. Yeah, he's got a certain way about him, hasn't he? He sort of approaches everyone sort of pretending at least to be a bit of a dunce. But he's a really,
he's got that dry sense of humor where he's trolling people,
dry,
but they don't really know they're being trolled. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, he makes me laugh, and he's started releasing a podcast during lockdown. It gives you a little bit more of an idea of his personality, how he plays dumb in order to extract what he wants from the subjects of his documentaries. But he does one, I don't know how long ago now, probably 5 years old at least, on sex work in a state of America, in Chicago somewhere. And so the arguments that say, well, you're a Christian, your views are fundamentalist, they're agendized, they come from this. But actually, this is a thoroughly non-spiritual, in my opinion, issue when it comes to the fact that he's not coming at it with an agenda as a Christian who wants to see people converted as any sort of evangelical nature whatsoever. He's just coming with a crew, right, to expose what does it look like, what are the lives like of the people that are working, whether they believe it or not, that they're empowered, they choose to do it. It doesn't take a huge amount of time to understand that their lives are broken and in some way, and it's quite clear to the viewer, and that's not from a religious point of view, from a judgmental point of view. I mean, your point about Jesus as a role model, what I love about it, without diving too much into the religious aspect, is a man that doesn't display any examples of being a self-righteous, judgmental character, right? He throws the first stone, it's like, that's the Jesus that I read about and connect with. And it's addressing these issues where you are taking that element of your faith and rather than unfortunately, sometimes I think it's projected upon you that if you are a person of faith, that you're coming from a pious, legalistic, puritanical, self-righteous point of view. It's like, how do you, and this, I'm talking to myself here, Benji, there's more than anyone. How do you not come at it from that angle, right? How do you come at it with love and not with judgment and with a genuine support to protect the most vulnerable? I don't know if that's even a question, but I think that's a challenge, isn't it?
I think fundamentally it starts with the issue of the cosmological question of our existence, you know.
Here we go. Here we go. This sounds good.
And so the story of Christianity is that a loving, benevolent father was motivated out of his own essence and nature and communal nature, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, that out of this communal being came this design and this creation for life and the cosmos and for you and I. And that kind of personal story that gives me inherent value and dignity. I was actually created out of a loving, benevolent being with a purpose for my life, is really anchors me in my worldview. And so that's first and foremost. But the narrative continues that our creation, humanity, turned their back on God and rejected and renounced God's design and plan and purpose for humanity. But God didn't then turn his back on humanity. He made a way of reconciliation and redemption. And so to me, the story of the gospel is God pursuing us in love, in our brokenness, to reconcile us into relationship with himself. And so I think fundamentally for me, you know, that story of Christianity is so powerful. It's my story. I believe it's all of our story. We all, again, are broken in many ways. And so anyone who comes away from Christianity with self-righteous, judgmental attitude, you have to wonder what else is going on there, because certainly they've lost touch with the fact that, like, it's not like y'all are broken. I'm broken. I needed a savior. Like, I'm a mess without God in my life, and without, you know, a faith that inspires me and a model to pursue a life of love and compassion. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a passage in this book of James. He said, pure and undefiled religion is ministry to orphans and widows in their trouble. And what he was talking about when he says orphans and widows, he's talking about vulnerable demographics of people. So this is a theme that we see throughout the entire scripture, is where the heart, like in Proverbs 2, where it says that God guards the paths of justice. It's the picture of a compassionate God who's looking down at humanity. His heart is filled with love and compassion, but he invites us to partner with him in bringing hope and salvation and deliverance and protection and compassion and healing to those who are in trouble, to those vulnerable demographics of people. So Isaiah chapter 1 deals directly with what you're talking about, because the nation had become very religious. Israel had become a very religious nation, but their heart was disconnected from the plight of the vulnerable. And so God rebukes them, and he says, even all your hyper religious activity, even your worship services are an abhorrence to me, because you are neglecting the plight of the orphan and the widow. So in calling them to repentance, he says, now do this: seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, help the orphan and the widow. And so to me, like, that is the heart, the essence, the centerpiece of Christianity that's embodied in the life of Jesus. That's what I'm drawn to. But self-righteousness isn't just a problem that some Christians deal with. It's a problem that everybody in our world deals with. I mean, look what's going on in the cancel culture right now. It's a completely punitive justice environment in which nobody is addressed for their mistakes on the basis of how can we reform or help this person, but on the basis of let's extinguish you from society for forever. So tell me that's not self-righteous. I mean, at some level, you have to assert yourself as like, I am perfect, you have done wrong, and now I will sit as your judge, jury, and executioner to ensure that you never have a voice or place in society again. So I would argue that the most self-righteous people in our world today are coming out of this toxic cancel culture environment. And it's not to say that there aren't some Christians that are self-righteous, but it's a problem. Self-righteous is a problem that affects humanity in every society around the world. So as humans, we struggle with that. Some Christians, we find reason to struggle with it because we think, well, we're right, we're justified, we're saved, whatever it is. But that's the story of the gospel, is we're all equal at the foot of the cross. We all are in need of the grace, mercy, forgiveness of God. And then when we receive that, to step out and live out that same love, grace, compassion, and mercy that he showed us. So that's what I'm trying to do. People, slam me for my faith. It come up with all kinds of things. If any of these people who, have done these hit pieces, just sit down with us. Like the problem is so much is happening online. And again, it's the cancel culture, but honestly, at the end, I've become, I'll just say this last thing on this. I've been going on. I've become shocked over the past year, all these hit pieces, and it's really a lot of them guilt by association, or a lot of baggage that doesn't really belong to me that is projected onto me because of being a Christian or whatever. I that was the furthest thing from my mind when I got into this. I thought I'm literally trying to just help people who are being trafficked and help reform people who are part of the problem by fueling the demand. I didn't imagine myself to be in the crosshairs of cancel culture and all this stuff. So it's been a wild journey. But look at Wilberforce. I mean, fighting slavery, that system of oppression during his time was not popular. And he was, they attempted to cancel him too. So
no, you've spoken really well on it, and it is a hot topic. And there's a wider thing, right, about colonialism and white savior and all sorts of issues that have, I don't know, the closer I get to talking with people doing their best to use their lives to help, there's a critic standing in the corner somewhere saying, you're exercising, this disempowering colonial rhetoric, and and I think this is such a shame, because what is the response to now? I'm not saying there's no value in that argument, full stop. I am confident there's been lots of mistakes made in the way we portray, like I mentioned earlier, we've rescued this person, they're sort of, their lives figured out. No, it's not. It's just the start, but, and painting ourselves as these heroes crashing through doors, and this is, you need a white guy to parachute in and sort out the Africa. I can understand how damaging and unhelpful and inaccurate that narrative is, and how widespread it's been used. So there's value there. I do not disregard that, but I've also seen such an aggressive attack on people like yourself, Benji, who are committed to seeing justice done, and they've had this such a negative, I don't know, this sort of muck thrown at you. And what's the best that could happen? You just to pull out. Oh, I'm not going to do it anymore. Then I'll just go back to living my own life, right? I'm the center of it, and I'll just serve myself. I'm going to stop trying to help around the world. You're right. It's not for me to do, and that's what they want, and that's my concern about this. And we love to categorize, right? So I'm conscious of it, just saying these things now, that I don't want to be thrown in with a bunch of nutty fundamentalist right-wing conservative loons. Like I don't want to sit over there, but then also I don't want to get flung over here at the other opposite side of the scale. It's a difficult world to navigate, and the more you speak up, the more I think there's a degree of acceptance, and you seem more at peace with it perhaps than I am. But just like, what, I'm doing my best. And if that's how you want to describe me, like, so be it. But I'm doing my best, and as long as I can honestly know that.
Well, I think the world has just become so polarized now, and there's so much pressure on identifying or belonging in a certain group. And the struggle and the challenge of today is not to become polarized, is to maintain critical thinking, to maintain objectivity, and to be able to stay true to your core values and wherever you find those, to affirm those, so I find some of my core values being represented and embodied on the left, and I find some of them being embodied on the right, and I find some of the things that I find abhorrent being represented and embodied on the left and on the right. For example, slander. I don't like the spirit of slander. I think it has a deteriorative effect on relationships, on our humanity, on our society. But people on the right and the left have just, fully signed up for unbridled slander one towards the other. Some doing it in the name of being righteous, conservative Christians. Some doing it in the name of being, righteous, social justice warriors. But for me, I'm like, it's poison. So I don't believe in our culture in that sense. I think our culture is bankrupt. I think our culture is sick. So when the culture is like trying to get me, say something about me or conform me to, I'm just like, I have a very low view of our culture from that standpoint of, I believe our culture is sick. I believe our culture needs help. And so I'm certainly not going to fall under the persuasion to polarize into one group or another. I have to live true to myself and remain a critical thinker and objective about the core values that motivate me to really want to help impact the world for good. And so, yeah, it's a vision of the world, it's a vision of society, it's a vision of, with this issue of human sexuality at a core and a fundamental level. It's like, just even on that level, does sexuality have value? Does it, like, what value does it hold? Is it meaningless? If it's meaningless, then why is adultery a thing? Why is child abuse a thing? So inherently it does have some value, mystery, potency, purpose behind it. We know if you introduce children to that issue too soon, it's damaging. That's the research, objective research by therapists and researchers have shown that this can be damaging. So there's an order, there's a maturity, right, to that issue. So we know there's something unique about sexuality in our world that deserves reverence, that deserves respect, right? You don't take your kid out at 5 years old and take them to a brothel, right? That would be damaging to that child. So what is it about this, and then can this issue of sexuality be properly respected and reverenced within the context of the commercial sex industry? So that's a question, for us as a society. Like, I don't want to live in a world where women are for sale in windows. That transactional approach to using women like slot machines has proven to be damaging. Just the international research that has been done for decades, the voice and testimony of survivors for decades have shown us this is damaging. So that's not the world I want to live in. And when people are advocating for that world on all these other me-centered arguments, I just think at some level, sorry, I keep going on, and I'll just say this last thing. At a very core level, the idea of society is that we're better in this together than we are alone. If you want to take a me-centered approach to society, then you can give up on the idea of society. Just say, I'm going to go live out in a cave somewhere by myself. But as soon as we start talking about we, you have to take the me out of it. Because the whole argument is like, well, this clearly is not something good for our society. It's not something good for our world. But I need to make money today. It's like, wait a minute, stop. Let's figure out a way to do this. And that's, again, what I like about the Swedish Nordic abolition model is the recognition that some people are going to be marginalized and vulnerable in our world. So let's figure out a way to support them that doesn't require them being exploited.
It's funny because I think certainly over the last few years, certainly during the Trump presidency, during Brexit, during sort of different political controversies of recent years, all of us at one stage have gone, oh, I wish I had Richard Branson's money, right? I'm going to go buy an island, right, have a yacht or whatever and do that. I can't exist in this place. I'm going to have to step out. And of course, that's not the right answer, right? We got to lean in. We got to get involved. But I think I certainly have been guilty of that. I wonder if there's a scrap piece of land somewhere I can purchase and start my own world where it's equal. And of course, we've done that, right? History's proven we do that each time, right? We're going to get it right this time. And we go out and, a bit Orwellian, a bit Animal Farm, but we fit into these systems almost automatically, almost an innate response to sort of life and society. It's complex, isn't it? And I think there is a pressure for us to live within category, right? It's almost like your Instagram profile, or if you're in a dating app, right? Okay, where do I sit on gay marriage? Where do I sit on abortion? Where do I sit on A, B, C, D? Right? And this is me. I'm a A, B, C, C, A, B, C, and it's weird. It's weird how that's like the fluidity, the nuance is being left behind in exchange for category. And I know we'll both keep running on, but you mentioned culture, right? And that kind of gives me an opportunity to segue back into your second documentary, at least the second one that I was aware of, which was on Netflix. Is it still on Netflix? I don't know in the UK if it might be.
Liberated, the New Sexual Revolution.
Liberated, the New Sexual Revolution, which I watched and cringed my way through as I saw my fellow countrymen at their very worst, and that's not said from a position of judgment as much as it sounds, because I've been there. I've done the lads' holiday overseas, and they go on holiday. I mean, this is just some of the characters in this documentary, but it focuses quite a bit on these lads from the UK in America on spring break. Woohoo, spring break, chasing women, and they're with a very, very singular approach to that experience, right? And it's I think it's an uncomfortable watch, because it's like, oh, I thought this good, I mean, you've either seen it firsthand, or I'm just imagining an older generation going, yeah, this is what I was worried about my daughter going to spring break this year, or whatever. Like, this is everything I dreaded took place. But yeah, how was that experience for you, being surrounded by teenagers just acting crazy when you've got a camera? And how was that, filming that?
We find ourselves in these environments because we're following a story, and there's a sense and a degree to which we can't really anticipate the outcome of where is this going to end. We're just signing up to go on the journey. And I want to tie this back to some of the conversation that we've been having today, is I never shared my faith with these guys or anything. I went down to be a fly on the wall, to follow them in their spring break adventure. They wanted to listen to this particular song. We drive them around a 15-passenger van. They wanted to go here and there, and so we had our film crew. We were driving them around. They wanted to listen to this song over and over again, by Swedish House Mafia, and it's like, don't you worry, child. Don't you worry, child. Heaven's got a plan for you. This, like, do you know that song?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Mafia? Okay, so it's a very popular dance song back when we were filming with them. Well, after the filming, Shay, one of the main characters, has a sports injury, ends up going through a lot of personal transformation in his life. So he decided to become part of the screening tour. Now he's like the main kind of like antagonist of the film. And audiences at college campuses were shocked to see him there after the screening, when, they'd be like, oh my God, this is like, and it was, it was a lot of shame for him to put himself in that environment, but he really wants to let people know, like, I've become a different person. Shay, to me, like, represents exactly what we want to see happen in our world. If we watch something like Liberated and we just go, this person is evil, extinguish them from society, we're not helping anybody. The idea is we want to see people change, because we all are going to make mistakes. We all have to go through a process of maturity and evolution. Well, he comes on this tour and he becomes very inquisitive about me and my values and where I'm coming from. Well, we're driving hours and hours in planes, staying in the same hotel room. So him and I got to spend a ton of time together. We're on this one trip, and I was just trying to explain to him, like, some of what I explained to you, like my worldview. I'm like, view our world as like, imagine like this vast property, and there's this fence around this property, and there's a hill and a cabin on the top of this hill, and a lake, you know, looking over a lake, and there's this property, and there's a sound that's going out of it. And there's a father who lives in this cabin, and there's a sound that he's sending out to draw people into his love and compassion and affection if they would just receive it. But some people are repelled by that, and some people are drawn to it, and some people are 5 miles away, and some people are just outside the house. God's inviting all, and we are all in different places. And I said, but the people who are outside of that hill, that aren't in a relationship, that don't can develop an impoverished spirit that's filled with slander and bitterness and resentment and all of these things, you know, God invites us to be free of all that, to come into a relationship with himself and experience his love and our purpose for being and all this. So I'm explaining all this to him, and I suddenly remember that years prior, this song was the song that they wanted to sing, like that they wanted to play over and over. And the song is about a father talking to his son. And he says, in a house on a hill over a blue lake. We start playing the song, and then it says this. The chorus is, don't you worry, child. Heaven's got a plan for you. And it just says that over and over. And I'm like, Shay, we were down at spring break. You were lost. You were taking advantage of these girls. You were living out of this really carnal existence that was damaging to you, damaging to the people around you. But even in the midst of that, God was speaking to you, and he's saying, son, you're lost right now, but heaven has a plan for you. In that moment in the car, when all this connected, he just starts bawling, and he's just like bawling and bawling and bawling and bawling. We get back to the hotel, we go to sleep that night. The next morning, he wakes up wide-eyed, and he's like, bro, I just had this dream. And I'm like, what's the dream? And he's like, you were talking to this father figure, and you guys were conversing, and I was off to the side, and I felt so much shame, like I don't belong here. And he said, and I was terrified that this father figure would notice me and shame me. And he said, and suddenly the father figure looks up at me, and he said, and I was terrified in that moment, and he points at me and he says, son, I love you. He's like, all that shame just broke right off of me. And so when we started filming Liberated at spring break, I had no idea where this story would end up. We're filming with these people who are at a really, you know, just, I would describe as like a very broken place in their lives. Not judging them, but just like acknowledging that a lot of like unhealthy practices, which we've all been at, but I had no idea where this would end up. But there's this passage where it says that we are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works. And that word workmanship means poem. It's the original word is poema. So it's this idea that God is this great, loving Father who's a poet and wants to write our story if we will yield and surrender ourselves to him. And to me, Shay's testimony and story is such a powerful example of that, because Shay had no idea, I had no idea that God was going to write this beautiful story in which Shay would eventually encounter his love, become free from shame, and is now giving his life to do good for our planet, for humanity, for the younger generation of men, and whose story is changing so many people's lives. So it's all the beautiful work of God's redemptive influence in our world. I can't take credit for any of it. I'm just stumbling along the way, bumping into walls and trying to figure it out. And I keep having these incredible experiences and testimonies that I get to be a part of. I mean, so many more like this, where it's just like, I'm so dull and dumb and broken and trying to do my best, and like God keeps showing up in these miraculous, transformative and powerful ways.
I'm laughing because at the start of this podcast, I said to Benji, I said, like, listen, you know, this is not a Christian podcast, but feel free, you know, Feel free if you want to talk about your faith, that's fine. But you just bear that in mind, and it's broken in, but that's okay. That's okay. It's funny, and I think it's probably worth mentioning as well. Like, I love that story. Like that story. It's a story of redemption. Like that's what gives me hope. Seeing people's lives change. That's what always lifts my spirit wherever I am on my own personal faith journey, whatever I find difficult about religion and whatever. I love stories of people changing their lives and being like, but I think it's also worth annexing it with, you don't become a Christian, life sorted, right? Oh, now now I've got a faith. I'm no longer, I'm perfect person now, right? And I think, did I say this earlier? I don't know, but one of the things I hate most is hypocrisy, and time and time again, sadly, we see sometimes high-profile Christian leaders. I'm thinking of Ravi Zacharias, who was an apologist, probably the most famous apologist in the world, for those who are unfamiliar with the term. That he would go around and he would argue the case in an academic and intellectual way about the legitimacy of God and the Christian faith. And it was discovered posthumously, I think, that he had massage parlors, right? He was trafficking women, or at least exploiting women himself when he was going about his ministries. And it's that, I think it's that, I don't know, that discontinuity, that ruffle that I have a real problem with. So I think it's just worth saying, like, I have seen lives remarkably changed, like you've just described with Shay. And from drug addictions lost and lives of crime transformed. I'm with you, Benji, mate. I really am. I do believe that is as a consequence of an interaction with the divine. Only that. No perfect therapist or drug can change someone's life so dramatically and so instantly. But it's also, I always feel, forgive me for adding anything of a negative tone to it, that it's not all over. Right, it's not. It's life sorted when I became a Christian. And ever since then, I've turned away from drugs, from sex, from this, and I've lived this perfect life. Because it's when you get to that place, of course, you come crashing down from the ivory tower. It's like it's a day-on-day thing, right? Well, that's my belief. You don't disagree?
And no, I actually had a chance to interview Ravi Zacharias once, and I asked him this very question about the issue of hypocrisy, and he had a very eloquent answer for me. And yet was somebody who had become completely detached from his own values, from his own identity, and he is another person who is contributing to the story of humanity over and over and over, testifying that we are a flawed and broken species, but there's a beauty in that. There's not a beauty in what he did, but there's a beauty in the imperfection of humanity and God's choice of us in that, to choose a flawed but beautiful humanity for a purpose. And so I didn't really intend to get all deep into this either. If anyone has become perked in this as a result of this conversation, I really recommend a book called it's a Henri Nouwen book called Life of the Beloved, because it deals in a very fundamental way with the issue of spirituality and the issue of identity. If we are a part, there's a couple arguments, right? One is there's a loving, benevolent creature who created this world. He had a design in mind, and that comes with certain implications. And the other one is that something came from nothing, and then from the goo to the zoo to me and you. Like, it was all kind of just over the billions of years of fortuitous concurrences, all just kind of like manifested into this beautiful reality. So from a cosmological perspective, I gravitate towards the idea of a loving, benevolent, intelligent being creating us, bringing us into existence. If that's the case, that has so many more implications for my life. And so what the Life of the Beloved gets into is this idea of being chosen, blessed, broken, and given. It takes the the sacraments as a metaphor for life. And so the very first thing that talks about being chosen. So our identity inherently being those who have been chosen. So I am the beloved. You are the beloved. You were chosen before the foundation of the world to come into existence. Immediately, the dignity that comes with that is transformative, is the dignity that comes with that has such a washing effect. Because so many of my life experiences say otherwise. You know, my dad left our family when I was 13 years old. We've all experienced rejections, betrayals, relational conflict, and so much of our life experience has hurt us, has traumatized us. And there's something powerful about moving all that aside and saying, loving, intelligent, benevolent being chose me as his beloved. So this book unpacks in, I would say, non-spiritual language, a very practical way to understand the worldview that I'm describing, that I think is so beautiful and has helped inspire my way of being in the world, of wanting to be in the world of a way that is characterized through love and compassion.
This is going to sound extremely clunky now as I try and reintroduce this documentary of Liberated before we even start talking about porn, which I can't wait to discuss with you. But it's, I don't know, we didn't give any, we just went off on one there and we hadn't really given any context to what Liberated was about, right? So it's following this spring break sort of these different characters coming over and partying and that transactional nature of sex and the objectification of the female form and the sort of predatory nature. And I have heard you from doing my research and speak very articulately on that, and that can tie us into the latest project, right, about the influence of pornography. And I remember as a kid when I was first introduced to pornography. I don't know, it was pretty young, but I'm what, 35. The internet wasn't around when I was a kid, and so I think it was a magazine. You know, I was playing football and some guy came along and brought a dirty mag and said, and it was like mind blown, irreversible, and moment in time. And then of course it becomes more and more accessible. You become more and more desensitized, I think, to pornography, and then you go on a journey. And I think even later stages of my life through my work, and it's easy to say, well, they must be, you know, this must be consensual, right? You know, so someone's getting paid, right? This is, you start making excuses why you would allow yourself to view it in some way, not even to cut out the religious aspect or anything like that, but in terms of the safety of the person behind. But of course, the more I've learned of maybe we skip into porn, but the porn industry, and quite like sex work, is actually the cover story is one that suggests potentially empowerment or choice, or, you know, there's an allure there. There's a superficial narrative that suggests it's all fine. What's going on here? And of course, in many cases, arguably in most cases, what's actually taking place underneath that, if you dared to look, is actually much more sad, much more savage, much more evil. And what's interesting since faith has been such a part of our chat, is there are more people who aren't coming at it from a faith-based point of view. I'm thinking of a guy I listen to quite a bit. I don't know if you heard of Russell Brand. And he's someone who's an famous British actor, comedian, and ex-drug addict, whatever, but he's a spiritual guy, but talks about actually the toxic nature of pornography and how damaging it is. And once that would be attributed to the likes of us, right? Saying, oh, it's the holier than thou clan trying to make us all feel bad. But there are more and more people coming from a quote unquote secular perspective and saying, no, we need to start thinking about like the toxic, the dark, the damaging nature of porn, how that influences behavior, how that normalizes aggressive rape culture and all of these negative consequences. And of course, as technology advances, children in these incredibly formative stages of their development are being exposed to this XXX pornography. Boys and girls saying, well, this as a girl, how you must behave, and as a boy, this is how you behave, at such an early age. So I'm excited to see what this documentary is going to include. But it's an issue, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue because globalization, because our world has been hardwired with visual devices now that we're all growing up in, because of the lack of protections online, because of the potent nature of just any visual experience combined with the sexual. So we live in a world now in which pornography is the wallpaper of our lives. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when young children are going to be exposed to it, and then what that will do to them in terms of prematurely awakening their sexuality. So we live in what I would describe as a corporately sexually traumatized planet. The images that kids are seeing online today are not a page out of a magazine. They are endless videos of the most graphic, hardcore, body punishing, violent, abusive, degrading sex acts imaginable that I don't even feel comfortable repeating. And if I did, you would have viewers being like, man, can you guys scale back the graphic name? But we're being exposed to those things, but we don't want to talk about it, but we're being exposed to them. So it's not only are we corporately sexually traumatized, but there's also an element of shame that comes with that as well. And I think that is hijacking the purpose and the calling and the destiny of a generation. And it's, yeah, so we absolutely have our work cut out for us. On a positive note, I believe we are beginning to see the most substantive traction in terms of addressing this issue that we've ever seen. And the internet is still relatively new, and there's just a lot of work that needs to be done to help make it a safer environment for our kids to grow up in, for us to be online with. But a year and a half ago, we started a movement called the Trafficking Hub movement, and to address the online distribution of pornography, and specifically the user-based model, upload model of how videos arrive on sites like Pornhub and other tube sites, X videos being another big one, YouPorn. And what we found is that there were no age or consent verification in place to qualify who was in these videos and whether they agreed to this or how old they were. And we found that these large tube sites were a cesspool of all kinds of videos of abuse and rape and trafficking and underage. And so we started a campaign that has really helped turn the tide on that. And we're continuing with that campaign, and we hope to bring about a permanent change to the way that pornography can be distributed online. We're about to kick off a new campaign, as I mentioned, called Protect Kids Not Porn. And central to that will be this documentary that we're just completing called Raised on Porn. And so we're really excited about what is coming here in the next few months with regards to rolling out a new campaign to, again, further address the issue of the way that pornography is distributed in our world, and the impact that that's having. So yeah, I just, regardless again of faith background, I just think that our children are the key to our future, and every decision that we make is voting for the kind of world that we want to leave them and the kind of world that we want them to inherit. And so I'm either, I look at it very simply, like Louie, I can't pronounce his last name. He's a National Geographic photographer. He said, you're either an activist or you're an inactivist. And I sort of look at it that way. You're either a part of the problem or a part of the solution. And I want to use my life choices to vote for a world that I would be proud to leave my kids, a world full of love and compassion, a world that protects children, protects the vulnerability of those who are marginalized and in vulnerable situations, a world that protects the dignity of sexuality, a world that that prioritizes the safety of children above the pleasure of men. And so that's why we're doing this. That's why these campaigns are important to us. And just to say, there's lots of ways for people out there to be involved. I really encourage people just to start by following Exodus Cry on Instagram, and that's a great starting point. But what we do necessitates the involvement of a larger demographic of people, because we're creating all kinds of content that, we want people to help get out there, petitions that we need people to sign. There's all kinds of calls to action. And again, whether people are faith-based or not, we can all agree that we want to make our world safer for children. We can all agree that, we want to address sex trafficking. So let's come together and get after it.
100%. You're doing a cracking job. I mean, I've been following it for a while now, and seeing it, your Instagram following swell, and I love the interviews that have been shared with the owners, the owners of Pornhub, MindGeek, being questioned, by the Canadian authorities, and just sweating, just really held to account. And I think this is great. This is great, and I mean, we're looking at significant impact. If I mean, where are we on that? It seems like, would there be a criminal consequence or some penal consequence? I mean, about the hundreds and thousands of cases of rape that's taking place on this platform, of child abuse, of child pornography, of all of these evils, of people that are coming forward and saying, I was a trafficking victim, can you please take this video down? And they're being ignored. And the search terms that are being used, then what's happening? Tell me someone's going to be held to account, Benji.
I think our collective action as a movement has begun to turn the wheels of providence, so to speak, in our favor, where the inevitability of them going bankrupt, being held criminally accountable, seems inevitable. And so it started with an op-ed that my colleague Lila Mickelwaite wrote for the Washington Examiner, and then we started a petition, and then we did a short animated video, and then we had an art contest, and then the whole world started to become aware, and then journalists started to write articles, and the pressure began to mount, and then billionaires and key tech people started to speak out, and then MasterCard and Visa and Discovery dropped Pornhub, and PayPal dropped Pornhub, and all these things have just been snowballing. And so now there's a series of lawsuits that are going forth and criminal investigations that are beginning to get undertaken. And so like it was with Harvey Weinstein, it was like there was one kind of like pulling back of oh, this is who this person is. And then it just scorched earth, And at one time it looked like, man, he might lose his place in the academy. Seemed like the big potential outcome.
Yeah, that's the worst consequence.
This guy might spend his life in jail. He's not even making a movie again. He's gonna forget that. So I feel like that's where we're at, is, we are invoking providence to come to bear, to hold these people to account, and to bring forth justice on behalf of the oppressed. And when the wheels of providence start moving like this, I don't think there's any way for them to escape. I think that they will be held accountable, and that we will see this mega super predator empire, MindGeek, that owns 90% of all online pornography,
wow,
brought down.
Wow. And I love that, because if the wealth and the power that is inherited as a consequence that they wield, right, and the influence is significant. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's this campaign group. So yeah, we'll take you on. I mean, talk about David and Goliath. I mean, I love that, and I love that the likes of MasterCard and Visa and PayPal are going, I want nothing to do with this. I'm going to close soon, but there's a US. I mean, you would have heard of this. I know you would have heard of OnlyFans, but it's a UK company still. It's got a significant investment from a US businessman who's made money in all sorts of ways. But we got to take ownership for this, right? This platform, and there's an argument. So the way OnlyFans works, unlike Pornhub, which is quite obviously a pornography site, OnlyFans classes itself as a social media site, right? It's quite clever in that regard. But the vast majority of content is pornographic. And what it says, once again, it's that empowerment argument as well, whichever you want to address that. But it takes 20% stake on whatever you make. And you have the power to sell, market yourself as you wish, release whatever content you wish. Now, whether that is doing a cookery show and darning socks, that's fine. Or whether it's sharing sex camming or explicit or extreme content, they're all welcome, right? And I've got a number of issues with it. But principally, there has been media that have started to discover and to expose the fact that children are on these platforms, whether they are doing so as a consequence of pressure or exploitation from a third party, coercion, whatever, or whether they're exploiting themselves. As a child, they should be protected. Those images, once they're out there, they're out there. And what's interesting as well from this sort of the point of view is the predators that seek out and find very young people, crossing their fingers and hoping they're kids, is if an individual sharing extreme content is found to be a child, the way they have to deal with it is to refund everybody that's bought and paid for content from this user. So it's quids in if you're a sex offender and you manage to find a fan on OnlyFans, because worst case scenario, you can get all your money back, right? And I mean, that's just one of a million reasons why I'm so uncomfortable with it. But this ground, it's like, let's create a playground, and you can go over there if you want to, experience what it's like to make flatbread pizza with Michael B. Jordan. And if you want to see extreme pornography, just go to this edge of the playground. But it's up to you. And that for me is like, it's not good enough. The technology has expanded. Expanded is the wrong word, but it has grown at such a rate that legislation has not caught up with it. And by the time something goes through courts in whatever jurisdiction, whatever country, and there's lobbying groups and there's arguments on either way, it's outdated by the time it's enacted anyway. It's almost toothless when we get there. And so I think there's something there, and I have a real issue with A-lists. So I can understand why someone goes, I'm broke, it's COVID, and I can send a picture of my boobs on this and suddenly I'm going to start making money, right? I get that. What I don't get and what I'm not comfortable with is the exploitation of children on that platform, willingly or not. And can we say willingly when someone's a child? And then on the same platform, it's endorsed by the likes of, Cardi B, Michael J, and Michael B. Jordan. All these huge celebrities are going, yeah, this is fine. Only famous in a Beyonce song, it's referenced, hundreds of millions of dollars. I think they turned over 1.9 billion last year. A platform that's allowing, and I don't know what they're starting, their total staff is 40 total staff. So how many people are adequately referencing and checking the identities of these people that are exploiting themselves on this platform, particularly children? So that's just another one, Benji. And once again, I'm venting at you, but it's a British-owned company that is practicing this harm, and it's masked in plain sight, right? It's featured in pop songs. I'm going to start an OnlyFans. And I don't know. I just think we're better than that. Come on, we're better than that.
Yeah. Again, I think it comes back down to a vision for our world, a vision for society, a vision for humanity. OnlyFans embodies a vision for humanity in which the sexuality of women is prostituted out to an entire generation. And it's not my vision. I think it's a sad indictment against our world and where we're at as a culture, that we have essentially become a prostitution culture. And I, for one, would hope to have more meaning in my relationships and build a healthier structure to raise a family in, that could eventually have, create a positive impact on our world. I don't see how prostituting the sexuality of a generation is going to help advance our world or our species. I think it's another example of the dark side of capitalism, in which everything is for sale, including people, including sexuality. And those are the things that grieve me. Those are the things that I weep over when I think about our world. Those are the things that I think God weeps over. I don't think it was part of his plan and his design for humanity. And I just think it has so much more for us, and we've in many ways put the cart before the horse. You know, if you could just jump to sex without any of the social interaction that happens before that, you're missing out on the experience of being fully alive in a relationship in which there's an exchange of energy and ideas and emotions and intellect and experiences and histories that set up the safety and for meaningful sexual interaction. And I think when you leave all that behind and you just make it popcorn, we're really missing out on something very special. And so hence, you know, the work that we're doing, we're fighting an uphill battle. We're fighting against a tide of in our culture that is going in the opposite direction. And we're just going to keep being a voice in a wilderness and trying to do our best to make a difference.
Good man. Close for me with something hopeful. I bookend every podcast with a question at the start about coffee and close it with, what is your hope for the future?
My hope for the future, you know, I don't think that we're going to rescue this culture, this society overnight, but I do believe that we can reclaim a vision for love and compassion as the centerpiece of our humanity. We saw this last year, how suddenly a generation can awaken to a justice cause, and how a flashpoint moment can really help move the needle on a justice issue. So I have hope that that we can see that trend continue in a positive direction. I think that what we've seen with the Trafficking Hub campaign this past year sets me up for a hopeful expectation of what we will continue to see happen with regards to the way that pornography is able to be distributed, and specifically with regards to the protection of children in our world. So yeah, our team is very optimistic. I'd say the most optimistic we've ever been about what the future holds for us. And that's the inspiration that keeps us going every day, is just that vision of like, we are at the threshold of making a massive change in our society that's happening. So let's stay with it.
Great place to finish. Benji, thank you so much. It's been a joy talking to you. I know we could have talked for a lot longer. We probably talked a lot longer than perhaps we should, but it's been an absolute joy. And thank you so much for sharing.
You're a great podcast host, and it's been awesome to have this time with you. Thanks for just letting me share freely about all this stuff. And yeah, appreciate it. We'll do it again.
Yeah, good man. Cheers, Benji.
Thanks. Cheers.
He's a good bloke, isn't he? Yeah, I really like him. He seems to me to present as an incredibly actualized individual. What do I mean by that? I mean that Benji clearly has a strong Christian faith, but he makes no attempt to hide that or compartmentalize it in order to have a wider appeal. He is comfortable in his identity as a Christian. His faith is him, and he is his faith. And it's from that position that he does what he does. It's not a sidelined characteristic or add-on. It is complicit in all he produces, whether or not that content is in any way evangelical. There is a coherence to him that I admire. I also recognise the power of filmmaking. It's such a scalable means of doing justice. A well-made movie or documentary can reach hundreds of thousands of people with a message and lead them into action. We've seen it time and again. How about you? How did you come to get interested in justice? Where did you first encounter the human trafficking narrative? I bet for a lot of you it was in a movie. You heard Benji describe himself as an abolitionist, and abolitionists do. They move beyond their phones and they step into action. They also organise, they unite in order to gain greater influence for their cause. This is something that I'm inspired by. How do we lend our voice to campaigns calling for justice around the world? How do we step up and fill the gaps where there is no campaign? How do we build a community of abolitionists who don't want to look the other way, but to lean in to the suffering and do something about it? Benji has a new film coming out on September the 23rd called Raised on Porn. You can view it on their YouTube channel, which is called Magic Lantern Pictures. I'll also put a link into the show notes. The film will be accompanied by a new campaign called Protect Kids, Not Porn. So look out for that one too. I thought maybe we could host a screening or something, maybe online or in person if we're allowed. What do you think? Let me know. Thanks for listening along today. I know it was a long one, but it was a goodie too, wasn't it? We've also put the video of that interview out on our YouTube channel. Actually, it's probably a bit too late to mention that now, but if you fancy taking a look, search Blue Bear Coffee on YouTube and I'm sure you'll track it down. Make sure you add coffee, though. Blue Bear will just get you a load of cartoons about a bear in the big blue house. They're also thoroughly entertaining, but I fear you might get dragged down a YouTube rabbit hole, never to appear again. Blue Bear Coffee podcast should do the trick. Drop us a message, let us know what you thought of today's conversation, and let me know if you have any subjects you'd like to hear on this podcast. You can do that by emailing me, bryn@bluebearcoffee.com. That's BRYN, not Brian, as I'm so frequently called, or DMing us at Blue Bear Coffee Co. on Instagram. I've put plenty of links in the show notes, links to the influential films Benji mentioned, War Photographer and The Cove. I've also put a link to the book Life of the Beloved, and of course a link to Benji's movies and the Exodus Cry Instagram profile. This podcast was produced by Blue Bear Coffee Co. We're holding a fundraising cycle ride this September the 4th in Norfolk in the east of England. Come and join us for the day and help us raise money for our charity partners. Follow along on our social media to get more details or visit us at bluebearcoffee.com. Speak soon. Stay safe. Peace.